Black markets are all around us.
It's military grade.
Yes, ma'am.
Hidden in plain sight.
Should I be concerned about my security?
Of course.
My name is Mariana van Zeller.
This hasn't actually ever been filmed before.
I'm a journalist on a mission to find my way inside.
No one's getting through the door.
Right now, it's go time.
Brand new Trafficked with Mariana van Zeller starts Monday at 9 on National Geographic.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Be Inspired event here at Disney. I'm James Longman, ABC News foreign correspondent, and today we're introducing you all to an incredible new series on National Geographic. It's called Trafficked and it's exploring the complex and dangerous inner workings of the global underworld. Smuggling networks, black markets, informal markets, you name it. Now, in a moment, you will see a snapshot of the show, and we're going to be speaking to Mariana van Zeller herself. She is the host. She's going to be giving you a presentation, and then after that, I'm going to be asking her some questions. So on that note, please, from right now, please send in your questions using the facility here. I will seek to aim to get to as many of them as possible. But first, here is a little look at what you can expect from Trafficked.
Much trouble, so we decided to want to try out something new.
Do you remember the first time you did it?
Oh, sure. On the phones, I met a guy, I think his name was Mike. First time he sent me like $500. I couldn't believe it. The first day of my life in this game, the amount of money I see.
Since those early days, Victor has risen to become what he describes as a mid-level boss.
How has the state of emergency affected you guys?
Oh, my team have to scatter, man. Otherwise, you'd come and see about 20 guys right here, right now.
Really?
I'm more, yeah. I have more than 200 people under my organization.
200 people working for you?
Probably more.
No way.
Of course.
Behind all the swagger is a young man who says he grew up on the rough side of Montego Bay, with very few options.
The most reason why we do this is just for survival. We have such a huge history of being broke and stuff like that, things taken from us, so, you know what I mean? Sometimes we just look at it as taking some back.
In other words, reparations. The idea that scamming white people is payback for a brutal history of slavery and colonialism. It's a justification that I heard from Tweety as well. It's also the title of perhaps the biggest scammer anthem of them all.
Them call it scam, me call it a reparation.
Watch Carter, yeah, reparation. It's my song, it's my jam.
Pick up every scammer, we make US dollar.
I love that song. I used to play it every morning just for like giving me energy to go through the day.
Have you ever had to hurt anyone because of scamming?
I never really have to take anyone's life through scamming, but I really roughed up and hurt people and stuff like that. I'm just finding a way to make some money, otherwise I'll be going out there trying to rob somebody. I was even thinking about doing it today, but I'm thinking you're a very nice person.
But you were thinking of taking our cameras and robbing them?
Everything, of course.
You were thinking of taking our cameras and robbing them?
Everything, of course.
There are cargo ships all around us. There's a fishing boat right here.
And then we see it.
Oh my Lord.
A row of large plastic barrels floating towards the small tourist boat we've been following. Barrels that have been tossed from the stern of a rust-covered fishing trawler nearby.
There were about 10 barrels, white barrels, that were thrown out to sea.
Packed inside are the potent chemicals the cartels need to create fentanyl.
I mean, it's so crazy. You look at it and it just looks like a totally normal fishing boat.
So, you saw her there. Mariana van Zeller is a Portuguese-American journalist and investigative reporter. She's a Peabody winning journalist and a career that's taken her around the world. This show, Trafficked, as you saw there, it's a fascinating one about illicit networks. We're talking everything from drugs and animals and guns in all corners of the world. And so over to Mariana for this short presentation.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I think I'll start by telling you all a little bit about myself and how I got here and how we got into the show. Well, I grew up in Portugal and I used to watch, I decided I wanted to be a journalist when I was 12 years old. This photo is actually of me a little younger than 12, but it's the dorkiest photo I could find of myself. But I decided, like I said, I wanted to be a journalist when I was 12 because I used to watch television, the nightly news broadcast with my family in Portugal every night, and used to watch these Portuguese anchors talking about what was happening around the world. And they seemed to know so much. They just had so much knowledge. And I wanted to be like them. Of course, I didn't know they were reading from a teleprompter, but that's when I decided I wanted to be a journalist. So when I graduated from school in Portugal, I applied to the most prestigious journalism school in the world, or one of Columbia University. And I applied the first year, and I didn't get in the first year. And I applied the second year, and I didn't get in. The third year, I flew to New York, and I knocked on the dean's door, and I introduced myself. And that year, I was accepted. And it taught me sort of my first important lesson in journalism, which is persistence and determination and never to give up. So I arrived in New York City to study at Columbia University. And a month after my arrival, I had been working until really late the night before one day. And in the morning, I was still sleeping. And at 9 a.m., my phone starts ringing. And it's ringing and ringing, and finally I decided to answer, and it's the Portuguese television station I worked at briefly, telling me that 9/11 had just happened. The Twin Towers had collapsed, and telling me that I was actually the only Portuguese journalist in Manhattan at the time, and asking me if I could go to Midtown to do a live report from this rooftop building in New York. And so I packed my bags, my stuff, my reporting stuff, my reporting gear, and I headed down to Midtown. And I remember arriving in this building in the rooftop and looking around and just seeing these journalists from all around the world, many of whom I'd been watching, growing up. Many of whom were my heroes. I was so nervous. I was 24 years old. I had zero experience doing live reports. But I did it. I went live. I told, did my story, all that. And then I remember walking down to the streets of Manhattan and seeing the first sort of signs of people looking for their loved ones. And it was, for me, a really impactful moment. And I think a moment that really changed my career as a journalist. It was the moment that I decided that the kind of journalism that I wanted to do was more in-depth, was more investigative, and really sort of contextualizing what was happening around the world. So a year later, I moved to Syria, and I enrolled in the University of Damascus to learn Arabic. The war in Iraq was happening next door. Of course, I didn't know, but Damascus was actually a big party town, and so I learned not a lot of Arabic, but I did sort of start looking for story ideas as a freelance journalist. I had no money at the time, so what I did was I bought Syrian rugs, and I would ship these rugs to my mom, who would host these tea parties with her friends in Portugal. And she sold the rugs and then sent me back the money. And with that money, I was able to buy this camcorder that you see here. And I reported on my first story as a freelance journalist. And it was about the Syrian Mujahideen who were crossing into Iraq to fight against the Americans. And I remember arriving in this border town with my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, and sort of being fearful about the people that I was about to meet. And also thinking, these are the people we at the time considered to be our enemies, and we know so little about them. So I was curious to learn more about who these people were, but also very fearful. But we spent a few days there. I was able to interview a handful of these jihadists. And it was also a moment for me that I realized that, there's the kind of journalism that I wanted to do was really sort of lead with empathy and not judgment and less judgment. And when I realized that even in these sort of underworlds, the darkest and more secretive corners of our world, how there's some sort of chaos how there's some sort of organization in the chaos. And I was fascinated by sort of trying to peel the layers to understand these systems and try to understand the people, the operators of these black markets. So I started reporting on black markets all around the world, and fast forward several years, and now I have this new show called Trafficked, where in each episode I investigated different black markets: guns, drugs, scams, sex trafficking. All of these episodes, they're sort of a wild ride where we gained unprecedented access into these black markets. And I think one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to do this show is this, we know so much about the sort of formal economy. There are whole TV stations, organizations that are devoted to analyzing every up and down, every twist and turn of the formal economy. And yet we know so little about these informal economies, these gray and black markets that actually make up for almost half of the global economy. So that's really sort of the idea behind this show. But I can't wait to hear your questions. So James, it's all yours now.
Hello. There we go. Thanks. Hi, Mariana. Thank you so much for that. And I know people are fascinated just to hear a little bit of your own story and how you come to get into this job. It's questions I get a lot of. People are so kind of just thrilled to see people doing these jobs, but also I know scared for them. And in that vein, there's someone here who's asked not just about what inspired the series, but just how you managed to get this thing commissioned. I mean, was it difficult to get it commissioned? I mean, presumably your bosses are probably scared for your own safety. I mean, I know mine are. Was that what does that look like? How do you go to someone and say, I want to go and put myself in enormous danger, please let me go?
It was years and years of knocking on doors, essentially. But I've been working with Nat Geo for a few years now, and I knew right away that they were the perfect partner. They are true believers in sort of the exploration of the world. They understand the importance of exploring the world, and even the darkest and sort of most secretive corners of our world. And I knew right away that they were sort of the perfect partners. We also share curiosity, which is, I've always been a very curious person, and I think that's really what sort of drives National Geographic, is this idea of curiosity and wanting to learn more about the world. But there's so much training and planning and security procedures that go into place before we ever even set foot in any of these locations. So obviously no story is worth a life, and there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes before we even get there to make sure that we minimize the risk.
I'm sure. In that first clip we saw, which actually helpfully played again because it just showed that little look that you give off camera after you're with that gentleman, I think it was in Jamaica, who said to you that he was going to steal all your stuff. The little look that you're giving to your producer off camera, what is that look? Are you scared for your own safety, or are you sitting there thinking, wow, this is the shot I wanted, this was that moment? What's going through your head in those moments?
It's a combination of both. I mean, I'm sure you've been there too. It's those moments where we're thinking this real quickly, but at the same time, this is great for what we're trying to do and sort of the world that we're trying to expose here. So it was both. I was definitely nervous. I remember I looked to see if my producer was also nervous, to see what his reaction was at the time. But I also knew at that moment that in these situations, the calmer you are and the more you show people that you sort of trust them and that you're not afraid of them, the more they will trust you back, and the better the outcome. I would say that in my head, there's a constant battle between curiosity and fear in these moments, and curiosity almost always wins, and sometimes that's not always good, but mostly it has been.
I suppose in some respects, from that man anyway, there was a little test involved. There was bravado. He was just sort of saying it to see what your reaction would be, and obviously you passed the test because you're sitting here. The thing that I find often with National Geographic is the access it gives you. I mean, when you say those words to people when you're going anywhere in the world, do you find that opens doors that you may not otherwise have had opened for you? Absolutely.
It really is a name. Not only is it recognized all around the world, but it's really a trusted name. So, one of the biggest challenges in my job is really trying to get people to trust us. When we're trying to access these black markets and these underworlds, one of the biggest fears that people usually have is that we're law enforcement. So a big part of our jobs and my team's job is really to try to convince people that we are in fact journalists and that we're there to listen to their stories. So whenever we mention the name National Geographic, it immediately helps us. Again, it's a name that people trust. So that's all we want.
Which is so valuable in this day and age. Frederick has asked a question here. What is your holy grail in terms of interviewing? Whom do you want to meet one day? I know that probably puts you slightly on the spot. If you want to think about it, you can. But is there one person you think to yourself, oh, I'd love to sit down in front of them?
I mean, there are so many. I tried interviewing El Chapo once, the head of the Sinaloa cartel. Wow. When he escaped prison, Altiplano prison, the high security prison in Mexico the last time. I actually went to Sinaloa and went up to the town where he grew up, called La Tuna, where a lot of people believed he was still in hiding. And I thought, one of the reasons I decided to go there was because I thought I would never actually be able to make it. I thought the Mexican security services would be all around and wouldn't let us go all the way up. And secondly, I thought that the Sinaloa cartel would probably prevent us from going. But somehow, after a 3-day journey of sleeping up in the mountains, sort of really rough terrain to get there, in a broken down Jeep, going through rivers and whatnot, we actually managed to get to the town. And we were able to see people who are family members of his. We asked if we could speak to his mom. She was inside the house. She came out briefly, but they said no. And essentially at the end, they basically said we had 10 minutes to leave town or they would send their men after me. Later, I found out I spoke on the phone with Chapo's son. But what was so frustrating was that a few weeks later, or sort of a month or so later, Sean Penn got the interview with El Chapo. Oh. I was scooped by Sean Penn, and that was, I couldn't figure out if it was a badge of honor or if it was the most infuriating thing in my life. But he's still somebody that I would be fascinated by interviewing, because I think that he has so much to offer, about the way that how it all, one of the most richest men in the world built the most powerful drug cartel. The drug trade alone brings in over $300 billion. So it's a massive, enterprise, industry. And I think the more we know about it, the more we sort of peel the layers again, the more we can do to combat these black markets.
Now, Nicole has asked, this is verbatim, it obviously takes nerves of steel to stay calm in these situations, but what was the most shocking encounter, experience, or personality you met during filming for Trafficked?
The most shocking, there were a couple of moments that were, we spent some time with some gunmen, some sicarios from the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico when we were doing the episode on gun trafficking. And there was one moment as we're entering their territory where they told us, look, while you're with us, you're protected, you're safe. If the Mexican Marines showed up, the feared Mexican Marines, there is nothing we can do. There's possibly going to be a firefight and we can't protect you and you're going to be stuck in the middle of this firefight. And we decided to go ahead anyway. And a couple of hours later, their walkie-talkies start buzzing and we knew something was up and they turned to us. They panicked and they said, okay, this is it, they're coming. And we could see the Mexican Marine, the helicopter coming towards us. So it was this really sort of, uncomfortable situation where we couldn't figure out. They started running towards their car. We started packing up our gear and running towards our car as well. And then we were out in the open with the helicopter visibly coming towards us. And we didn't know if we should follow them, follow their car. And if they would start targeting their car, then they would probably think that we were part of that group and target us as well. Or if we'd stay behind and sort of try to hide in the bushes, which was also not a great idea because we had nothing to hide and we'd be really suspicious. So it was a really sort of awful moment where we didn't know what was happening. And of those sicarios that we were with, two of them, there were three, two of them have since been killed. So it really tells you a lot about sort of the world that they operate. But I would say that the most shocking, really, truly the most uncomfortable moment of the whole series when we were shooting the fentanyl episode, and we followed this woman, this pregnant woman, crossing the border from Mexico into the United States with 5 kilos of fentanyl in her car. And I'd spent the day before with her, and I'd gotten to know her. I knew she had kids at home. And then the next day there I was sort of following her as she's crossing the border and witnessing it firsthand. And there's this moment that she's actually called for secondary inspection. And I was really, really torn because on the one hand, of course, I didn't want the drugs to come across. I've been reporting on the opiate crisis for over 12 years now. So I know full well the impact that these, the most dangerous, drug, which now is fentanyl in America, has on people. I was fully aware what that would mean if it came across. But on the other hand, I'd also gotten to know this woman. I knew she was pregnant. I knew she had kids at home. And I knew that if she was arrested, what that would mean for her family. So it was a really sort of tough moment for me as a journalist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I suppose at what point do you draw the line, or are you, I suppose, forced to tell the authorities about something that you've discovered. I mean, filming something like this, you must be constantly asking yourself that question. But then you destroy your sources and destroy the opportunity to film. But at the same time, if there's an illegal act being committed, it's then surely your responsibility to tell someone.
So what's interesting was what happened next is that she was stopped for secondary inspection. She had Border Patrol come open her car. The dogs came and sniffed her car, and yet she was allowed to continue. And I caught up with her on the other side of the border, and she told me that, obviously very difficult for us to corroborate this, but she said she wasn't nervous because she knew that one of the guys, perhaps even more of them, of the Border Patrol that were on the border that day were actually paid for by the Sinaloa cartel. So she knew she would not be stopped, or that she would be allowed to go. So I think that how I see my job, and I'm sure you see it the same way, James, is that at the end of the day, I'm there as a journalist. I'm not law enforcement. My job right there at that moment is to raise awareness as to what's happening. And I hope that by raising awareness, I can sort of make some sort of a difference in the world, in particular in these black markets and how they operate. But I don't see my job at all as somebody that would, at the end of the day, these are people who are opening up their lives and their stories and giving us incredible access. And again, I want to raise awareness and show how this is all happening.
We've got a question here from Kirsty, and I suppose there's two parts of this, because obviously we're living during a pandemic, but also you're doing dangerous things. So in both of those respects, how do you keep yourself and the crew safe while filming? Presumably there are kind of mechanisms that you always use, that you don't want to give away your secrets, but a few of them would be nice, because I know people wonder about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So we finished filming season 1 actually just before the pandemic, in February. And then we went into post-production and decided in July that we wanted to go back on the road. And we got commissioned for season 2, which was great, from National Geographic. So we're currently working on more episodes. And one thing that I realized as soon as we started reporting was that actually black markets around the world have exploded during COVID. Whenever there's an economic downturn, whenever people lose their jobs, they have to figure out a way to make money and bring back food for their families. And a lot of times they, sometimes are forced to join black markets, to enter sort of these underworlds. And that's what's been happening. So whether you're talking about drugs or guns or sex trafficking, I mean, you name it, and there's truly been a huge rise in all of these. But I've been operating, I mean, this is already a really challenging series to film, as you can imagine, just gaining access into these worlds, the security and the risks involved in all of this. That we're just adding, obviously, another layer. We've been filming for over 8 months now. We've all been able to stay, COVID-free. We get tested every week. There's all these COVID protocols, weekly calls that go into place. And it's definitely hasn't been easy. But obviously, priority number one is to stay both healthy and safe all the time.
Now, there's a few of these, and I'll just ask you the one time, but people always love to know your favorite or your best. There's always a superlative involved, and it's very hard, I know, to answer those sorts of questions. But Lauren asks, out of all the black markets you went into, which one surprised you the most? I suppose, which one did you have preconceived ideas about, which then went out the window as soon as you were there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren. I think it would be... it's difficult to ask me about what's my favorite episode, because it is a little bit like asking what's your favorite child, right? Because you put so much work into all of these. But I would say that the most surprising for me was actually the second episode we filmed, which was about scammers. I don't know what I was expecting, but I certainly have received a lot of these phone calls from people saying, that I'm past due on my electrical bill or this and that, and these scams that happen, all around the world. And so I was very curious to meet the people on the other side of those phone calls. And I think I'm not sure what my idea was beforehand, but I certainly didn't think that I would relate to them as fast as I did. So the first scammer we actually interviewed was a female scammer called Tweety. And while interviewing, she's sort of a larger-than-life character, incredible woman. And she started telling us how she works at a resort, one of these tourist resorts in Jamaica, in Montego Bay, during the day. And very early on, she realized that Americans are spending, mostly Americans, but tourists from all around the world are spending more in a day at the resort than she makes in sort of a month, sometimes even a year of working at the resort. And one day she came back home and she realized that her grandfather was very sick and that he needed treatment that she and no one in her family could afford. And she was very close to her grandfather, and she had to make a decision. And I need to save my grandfather, and the fastest way that I can do this is by starting to scam people. It was an industry. She saw people around her making money from it, and she says that for her it was a very easy decision. And she grew up in a very religious family, and she keeps talking about God being a very important sort of presence in her life. But it was the moment that she realized that actually in her family she was God. And she said it, and she said, I am God, and I needed to make this decision, and it was the way that I could make to save whatever I needed to do to save my grandfather. And again, it was when you hear these stories and you realize that, these people that we consider the bad people, the most ostracized and stigmatized people in our society, that you actually, if you sit down and listen to them, that you have a lot more in common with them than you'd like to admit. Their mothers, their fathers, they have dreams and aspirations and goals much like us. And a lot of times it's because of a lack of opportunity that they go into these worlds.
It strikes me listening, sorry, and this might be much too specific, but I mean, in this country, we get a lot of phone calls from people saying, hello, Mr. Longman, I know that you've been involved in a car accident. Is that part of these scams? I mean, where are they likely to come from? This man has a British accent, but maybe he's not calling me from Britain. And what is his aim? Is it the longer I spend on the phone, the more money he gets? I mean, how does it work?
No, they actually get you to pay. So, yes, a lot of these phone calls are actually coming from Jamaica. Jamaica has sort of become the new Nigeria in terms of scamming, especially these phone scams and what we call the lottery scam. So one typical one they do, and we saw them doing it, it was really fascinating, is they call you and they'll say, hello, Mr. Longman, have you shopped at Target recently? I'm not sure if Target exists in Europe, but have you shopped at Target recently? And you say, no, but have you shopped at Safeway? And then eventually they're going to hit something that you've shopped at. And you say, actually, I have. Well, we're running a lottery in all these different supermarket chains around the world. And it turns out that you've shopped there, you have won this incredible prize. You've won a Mercedes-Benz. So all you have to do right now, Mr. Longman, is you send us $300 to pay for the tax for this $150,000 Mercedes-Benz. And maybe, they sweet talk you, and they're great. They're so good at doing this. And they eventually sort of are able to convince people to pay those $300. But then this is where it gets really incredible, amazing, is that they will send you, they know your address, they have your phone number and your address, and they will send you the key to a Mercedes-Benz. And you're home and you receive this, and then they call you, Mr. Longman, have you received the key to your brand new luxury Mercedes-Benz? And you say, yeah, I've received the key. And then you're a believer. Okay, this is happening.
You're hooked.
It's real. You're hooked. And then they say, well, now you just have to pay the transportation fee, which is $3,000. And then the more you pay, the more you're inclined to do more because you don't have to admit, right? It's brilliant.
If I had been in that call center where you were, I would have just gone around each computer deleting my details. I get so many phone calls from these people. I had no idea. That is, I mean, genuinely, it's probably the least sort of glamorous one that you've done, I would suggest, because there's so many of these. You're putting yourself in real danger. But then that kind of thing, I just think that so many people have experienced a phone call like that. I mean, millions and millions of people have had those calls. So, yeah, I mean, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
You've answered this a little bit, but there is real interest here on giving space, and I get this question a lot, but when you're shining a light on like the underworld, a lot of people they'll say, well, why are you giving media attention to criminals running cartels or illegal businesses, and are you glorifying them? You're presumably conscious of that when you're filming. What goes on there in terms of making sure that those things aren't happening when you're speaking to criminals?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very simple. Unless you address the root causes of black markets around the world and what makes people turn to black markets, you're never going to be able to change or stop them or to have any sort of impact. So that is always my goal, to again raise awareness to what is happening around the world in these black markets and how people turn to black markets and all of that. But I'd say in terms of the glorifying, I take my job very seriously, and of all the people I interview, I ask them I ask them hard questions. I never shy away from asking them the questions if they're, about the impact that they have, the work they do, whether it's, drugs killing people or the guns that they're using or, the scamming, the victims around the world. There are people who have committed suicide because they've lost all their savings. So those are always very important questions for me. You're always told the sort of things that you can and cannot do when you enter these worlds. Please, make sure you disguise my identity, or please don't show the location, or, roll down your windows when you enter cartel territory so they can see who you are. There's all these rules that you sort of agree upon before you enter these worlds, but I have never been limited on the sorts of questions that I can ask. And, in doing my job as a journalist, ultimately. So I by no means do I think I'm glorifying. I'm showing the truth, which ultimately is the job of a journalist, is to show the truth.
And the truth is complex. I think a lot of people look for black and white, but a lot of the time there is no black or white. It's a lot of grey.
Absolutely.
There is a question here. Actually, I'm going to ask you, and I'm quite pleased actually that no one has thought to ask this question, which actually maybe says a lot about people at Disney. But no one's asked. Well, I'm going to ask it. What's different about doing this as a woman? Are you getting access that I wouldn't be able to get? Are you doing things that I can't do? I mean, I imagine you are. But what's it like? And is it worse being a woman?
I would say that I am getting more access than you would, but only because I'm more charming. Just kidding.
It's impossible. I'm British. That's not true.
Definitely not. I would say that yes, being a woman has really, truly helped me. And I tell you why. I think that women are seen as less threatening in these worlds. In a lot of places that I've been told that I've been the only woman to ever gain access into these worlds, whether it's sort of illicit, cocaine labs or fentanyl labs. Again, they tell me we've had this operating for years and never you're the first woman here. And I think that there's sort of the novelty aspect of it that is sort of disarming for them. And I also think that women tend to sort of look at the world with more empathy. And that is at the core of, I think, why I gain access into these worlds. It's because I make it very clear from the beginning when I'm there that I'm not there to judge. I am there to listen to them. And I think that really goes a long, long way in gaining access. So empathy is truly key.
And perhaps also, I don't know, I mean, from the examples that you've given, it does seem to me that often women find themselves used more spectacularly than men in a lot of these in a lot of these kind of environments, whether it's that lady that you met who was used to smuggle drugs, or obviously women are sex trafficked. I mean, often the men that you're speaking to are using a lot of women for their own gain. So there's something intriguing about that dynamic when you go and ask the questions to someone who's used to abusing women. Absolutely.
I mean, it's a very male-dominated world, these black markets. I would say that 90% of the people we interview are men in power, usually. So I actually think, again, that's why it's so helpful. Who better than a woman to be asking those questions about the way, in the sex trafficking one and the pimps one, for example, where I had the opportunity to sit down with, a handful of these men and ask them, what is their motivation? Why do they do what they do? And what is, how do they feel? And I could place myself in the shoes of the women very easily, which very helpful in that case. I would say that in every respect for me, obviously there have been situations where I haven't been allowed in places because only men are allowed, or some BS like that drives me crazy.
But by definition, presumably then you can go to where the women are allowed because men aren't allowed there either. So you've got, you lose out there, but you can go to the other side of it.
Now, it turns out actually, James, that there are a lot more places in the world where women aren't allowed than the opposite. I remember I was filming with a Nigerian rebels once in the Niger Delta, and we wanted to film their headquarters where they do their training before they go and kidnap foreigners, oil workers in Nigeria. And I was with my husband at the time, and we finally met these rebels, and they were taking us to their headquarters, and we arrived on a boat, and they said, "I'm sorry, women aren't allowed. It's bad juju." And it drove me nuts. It was one of those incredibly frustrating moments. So he got to go and film it all, and I was put in. Oh,
I suspect that was probably more frustrating, just the fact that he got there and you didn't. Just
oh,
all
absolutely.
the people.
Oh, absolutely. If they had said none of you can go, I'd be mad, but not as mad at the fact that it was because I was a woman.
What's that? So I believe that you work alongside your husband, and he also works at National Geographic. Is that right? So are you in some of these places together? What's that dynamic like?
Yeah, so we traveled all around the world together. I met him at Columbia University. He was a print journalist, or wanted to be a print journalist, and I sort of convinced him to travel the world with me, to pick up a camera and start traveling around the world together. So we did travel all around and did stories from everywhere. Nowadays, and then we had a son 10 years ago, and it sort of became a little harder to travel together. So we own a production company, which we produce the show for National Geographic. It's called Muck Media. And he sort of helps. He's a partner. We run Muck Media together. He's one of the executive producers on the show, but he doesn't go out on the field with me anymore. He does his own stories, and he travels, and yeah.
So he's just sitting back there. Ordinarily, anyone else may be terrified, but he knows you, and he's like, "Well, she'll be fine."
He does. I'll tell you a quick story which sort of really defines our relationship, which is I was doing one of the fentanyl stories I did a few years ago, actually. I gained access to, again, the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, and I really wanted to film a fentanyl lab. And they told us, I waited for days and days, and finally they came and they said, "Okay, I'll take you there to this lab, but we have to blindfold you, and we can only take you in the middle of the night." So I called my husband and said, "Okay, so they're saying that they'll probably pick me up after midnight and they're going to blindfold me. What do you think? Do you think this is a good idea?" And his first answer was, "Yes, just make sure that the cameraman films them as they're blindfolding you." So he's a filmmaker.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will be worried about that answer, but I mean, that's what it takes. We've got a question here from Grace. Has your initial opinion changed of any of these black markets from filming this series? You may have had some ideas about what they were like. I know we've had something similar to that earlier, but did you have a complete about turn on any of these experiences when you saw them up close?
I did. First, I think we tend to think of black markets as happening in very faraway places and sort of hidden underground locations. And in fact, black markets are happening all around us. They're really widespread, and they operate much more out in the open, a lot of times in plain sight. A couple of the scenes that we filmed for this season one actually happened just a few miles from my home here in Los Angeles. We filmed a car being packed with AK-47s and AR-15s just 10 minutes from my house on a regular weeknight. It was a Wednesday or Thursday night at 9 or 10 p.m. right next to one of the biggest freeways, one of the major freeways here in LA. And you could see it out in the open. They were bringing these guns and putting them and, hiding them in this car, right with families and cars driving by. It was insane. I couldn't believe it. And we filmed it all. So again, I think we think that these happen in very hidden locations, and it's sort of brilliant if you think about it. The reason why they operate in plain sight is because they know that the more they hide these things, the more suspicious they will be for law enforcement. So the more they operate out in the open, and the more they sort of blend in with what's happening around them. We filmed a lot of the drug operations around the world happening using, for example, tourist operators, where they'd use tourist boats and tourist the t-shirts from tourist operators to sort of blend in tourist towns by selling their products. It's really fascinating stuff.
It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah, it really is. So they're all around us. I mean, no matter how far or close you travel, you'll see that, a lot of times the woman, your neighbor, can be a sex trafficking victim, that right outside your door there could be a drug deal or a gun deal happening, and that in your pocket you might have a fake $100 or €100 note right now, and you have no idea it's a fake.
I've got a question here from Kirsty, something a little bit different, but do you have any advice for an aspiring journalist?
Yeah, I would say the number one advice for me is really persistent. And I go back to the story of me attending Columbia University and, not giving up and applying 3 times and then flying to New York and knocking on the dean's door. It really was truly my first sort of big important lesson in journalism is just don't give up. And as a freelance journalist after that, the amount of times that I had to call places, networks, and you'd send them email after email, and then you'd start calling, and you just don't give up. And also, if you believe in yourself and if you have a dream, my story of selling carpets in Syria is sort of trying to figure out a way to make that dream happen. Again, if you stick to it, it will happen for you.
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, I'm thinking of John le Carré, who sadly just died, but one of his famous phrases was, he's never heard a bigger sound than the sound of silence in Hollywood. I mean, the idea that you just continually go and go and go and go and go, and no one ever speaks to you, and then suddenly you get something coming through. Holly has asked, what is your ultimate career highlight? We're going to really put you on the spot with this. Do you have an ultimate? I mean, I know I've asked you about the person you'd love to interview, but what have you done in your career which you feel really does stand out? You can pick a few. That's fine.
Okay. I would say Trafficked, this show, for sure, to start with. I mean, it's been a lifelong dream of mine to have a whole show devoted to black markets. And, to be able to explore, again, these worlds that have an enormous impact on our daily lives, but yet we know so little about. So Trafficked has really been, and to be able to work with National Geographic, the best partners for a series like this, has really been a career highlight. And then I would say, 10 years or so ago, I've been covering the opiate crisis for very long. And the first documentary I did on the subject was called The Oxycontin Express, and it was about these pill mills in South Florida and how they were sort of giving out Oxycontin as if it were candy. And we got to this point now where, and back then as well, where the opiate epidemic is the worst epidemic in American history. And it started in sort of these pill mills in South Florida. And so to be there at the beginning of this gigantic crisis and to sort of expose what was happening when so little of it was known at the time, and to see then the impact that a documentary could have and how the laws changed in Florida after the airing of our documentary, and receiving calls from, senators in Florida and law enforcement all around the United States and trying to figure out what they can learn. Realizing how the work that you do can actually have an impact on people's lives is incredible. And I think that's all we want as a journalist. It was a real career highlight.
Wow. I think there's such a value in what you do for many, many, many reasons. But at the moment, there's such a focus on, what we would call conspiracy theories, the idea that there's somehow a dark state, that there are nefarious, actors at work, and that, we're all being kind of puppeteered by these sort of overlords. And I suppose what your work does is shine a light on what's really the real issues, not to have these distractions. Do you think there's something in that? What do you see when you see all these? I'm talking about things like QAnon and these other conspiracy theories that kind of people might see across their Facebook feeds, or you deal with real underworlds, not the kind of fake online version of it. What would your message be to people who are seeing those sorts of messages reverberating?
I'd say that journalism is incredibly important, that getting your news from reputable news organizations is more important now than ever. I think social media has had, we all know, a terrible impact on truth. Ultimately, if you look around the world in terms of journalism and you see that, journalists are being killed, journalists are being silenced, and here in the US and in Europe as well, journalists are being called fake news. And it's more important than ever for us to do our jobs as journalists and to seek the truth and not to fall into these, whether you're giving, there's a lot of talk about journalists needing to be objective. I don't see journalism that way. I see, or giving equal amount of time to this side and this side. That's not our jobs. I believe that our jobs is to find the truth No matter how hard that is. And I hope that's what we're trying to do with this show, is to go to these places, boots on the ground, old school journalism, get as close to the action as possible, and really be able to show people what is happening and show people the truth. I had a journalism professor once told me something that I really loved, which is, in journalism, you need to be absolutely sure that you never cross the line, but you have to come back with chalk on your feet. Meaning you get as close to it as possible. And that's been sort of a real driver.
Cristiano Amport talks about the difference between truth and balance. The idea that we focus so much on balance, but that really does divert us from real truth. And it's, I think, shows like Trafficked, which really show people what's actually happening rather than this kind of formulaic version of the world, which I think a lot of people tune into. Well, we are being asked here by one man, Robert, who's asking, you've done a lot of amazing work in your life, but is there a topic you'd like to cover, but even you feel that it's just too dangerous, something that you just won't do?
Hi, Robert. That's a good question. I would say, there have been stories we've wanted to do or Trafficked, where it's in regions of the world that are just too dangerous. Regions of the world where there's terrorist organizations, for example, and there's really no amount of preparation and training that you can do to minimize the risk in those situations. So we're still trying to figure out a way that we can go to those parts of the world and try to tell these stories in a safe way. Because it's just really hard when you know that this is happening and when you get people to tell you that you can't do it. We know we can't do it because we don't want to put, our whole teams on my life. It's just too risky. But it's still frustrating because we know these are happening and that, these black markets are growing in these areas partly because, they're funding terrorism. I'm not going to tell you what these black markets are, but trying to go around it.
She doesn't want to give away her stories, Robert. You can't ask her to give away her next idea. We've not got too much longer left. I am interested though to know, of all of the episodes of the series of Trafficked, which launches in January, is there a character with whom you really empathized, who you really felt for, who your heart bled, and you really just, it stayed with you? Because often in this work you come across people and you never forget them, and often they do stay in your lives. You'll probably have people who are messaging you now 10, 15 years later, but who was that person for you throughout the Traffic?
Absolutely. So it was when we were doing the cocaine episode in the Vrame Valley of Peru, where a lot of the world's cocaine comes from. And we spent a night with these mochileros, these backpackers. A lot of them are teenagers actually. And their job is to carry these really heavy loads of cocaine out of the valley for days on end. And it's incredibly dangerous work. They've seen their best friends be killed some of their best friends be killed in front of them from rival groups. And it's just, again, backbreaking and dangerous work. And we spent a night around the fire talking about, interviewing them and asking them why they do what they do. And one of the kids, who at the time was about 18 or 19 years old, but had been doing this since he was 14 or 15 years old. And I asked him, so why do you do this? It's so dangerous. It's really difficult work. And he said, look, I grew up in a very poor family. I realized very early on that I wouldn't have many opportunities with them. And I wanted to go to college. That was my dream. From when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to go to college. And I knew my family couldn't afford for me to go to college. So the only way that I could make money and afford college was by doing this kind of a job. It's sort of the only opportunity out here. Coca leaf and coca production and coca smuggling is the backbone of the economy in this area of the world. And so for him, it was an easy decision. I asked him, why do you want to go to college so badly? He says, because I want to be a dentist. And I asked him, why a dentist? He says, because I want to make people smile. So this was one of the first episodes we filmed, but I remember listening to the story and thinking, this is it. Stories like this kid's story, like Tweety's story in Jamaica, these are ultimately the stories that I hope will resonate with people. I know this is, at first glance, a dangerous and somewhat, you might think, depressing show because it is about black markets. But ultimately, the message I hope that people gain from this is that if you can place yourself in people's shoes, people that you think have nothing in common with you, but that's the power of documentary filmmaking. And I hope of a series like this, that even if for just a little bit, you can put yourself in that person's situation and you can understand why they made the decisions that they made. Then I think we've made our jobs. We've done our jobs. And again, I think we can raise awareness, approach and address the real issues and the root causes of these worlds, and really try to make a difference.
Wow, it's almost like you knew that was going to be the last question. It's amazing. That was the most perfect way to end the talk. Thank you so much, Mariana. I mean, listening to all that, ultimately these are human beings at the heart of it, and this looks like it's a fabulous human stories all put together in this Trafficked series, which airs in January, I believe. So next month, it all hits streaming next month and on TVs around the world on National Geographic next month. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thanks, James. Love being here. Thanks, everyone.
And so, yeah, Trafficked. It's on National Geographic from next month all around the world. Please tune in, and thank you very much for watching today. Bye-bye.